Pamela was a gorgeous 12-year-old black girl with deep brown skin that glowed with youthful radiance and a striking beauty that made her stand out. Her bright eyes held an innocent glow, and her wide, dimpled smile could light up even the gloomiest of rooms. She was full of life, her laughter ringing through the walls of their luxurious home in the heart of the city. She lived what many would call a dream life, attending one of the best schools, dressed in the finest clothes, and having access to anything she desired. On the outside, everything about Pamela's life seemed perfect. Her parents, Dr. Emmanuel and Mrs. Vivian Cussy, were successful professionals. Her father was a well-respected doctor, spending long hours at the hospital, and her mother was an ambitious investment banker, always busy with meetings and client calls. They loved Pamela, but their definition of love was providing for her needs rather than being present in her life. Pamela had all the material things a child could want. Her room was filled with dolls, books, and expensive gadgets. Every year, she had the grandest birthday parties, where distant family members and her parents' business associates attended. But amidst the luxury, one thing was missing: emotional connection. Her parents were rarely around. Conversations at home were brief and often one-sided. They would ask about school in passing, but before she could answer, they would be distracted by a phone call or an urgent work matter. At school, Pamela was a bright and cheerful student. Teachers adored her for her intelligence and politeness, and classmates admired her for her kindness. She was the kind of child who shared her lunch with friends and stood up for those who were bullied. Yet, despite the love she received from those around her, there was always an emptiness in her heart, a longing for attention, for a warm embrace from her parents, for someone to truly listen. The person who spent the most time with her was their housemaid, Auntie Paulina, a woman in her late 40s. Paulina was strict and often impatient with Pamela. She cooked, cleaned, and ensured Pamela had everything she needed, but she was not the nurturing type. Whenever Pamela tried to confide in her about her feelings of loneliness, Paulina would dismiss her with, "Your parents are working hard for you. You should be grateful." Pamela often envied her friends whose parents attended school events and spent weekends together. She would watch them excitedly run to their parents after school, wrapping their arms around them, receiving kisses and words of encouragement. She longed for that feeling, but whenever her parents did pick her up, they were always in a hurry, distracted by their work or their phones. Deep inside, Pamela wished for more than just material gifts. She wanted bedtime stories, heartfelt conversations, and warm hugs. But in the Cussy household, emotions were secondary to success. And so, she learned to smile through the emptiness, convincing herself that this was normal, that this was love. Little did she know, the lack of presence from her parents would make her an easy target for the darkness lurking ahead. Pamela had always been a bright student, excelling in all her subjects, but mathematics had never been her strong suit. When she transitioned into junior high school, the school assigned a new math teacher to her class, Mr. Cliff, a tall, lean man in his late 20s with an air of confidence that made students both respect and fear him. At first, he appeared like any other teacher, strict but fair. He explained concepts well, and his students performed better under his guidance. But it wasn't long before Pamela noticed that Mr. Cliff seemed to pay special attention to her. Whenever she answered a question correctly, he would smile at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. He started singling her out, praising her in front of the class, and even jokingly calling her his favorite student. At break time, while her classmates rushed to the playground, Mr. Cliff would sometimes find excuses to keep her back, asking her to go over her classwork or redo an assignment he claimed needed corrections. Pamela, eager to please her teachers and accustomed to adults taking interest in her academic progress, saw nothing wrong at first. Soon, his gestures became more personal. He would place his hand on her shoulder when he spoke to her, linger a little too long when handing her books, and look at her in a way she couldn't quite understand but instinctively felt was wrong. Her classmates noticed and whispered about it, but they dismissed it as favoritism. "Pamela is lucky," one girl remarked. "Mr. Cliff really likes her." But Pamela wasn't sure she liked the kind of attention she was getting. One day after an extra math class, he asked her to stay behind. "I noticed you struggled a bit with today's topic," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I want to give you extra lessons so you can improve." Pamela hesitated. She wasn't struggling in math, at least not more than any other student. But when a teacher insisted on extra help, how could she refuse? She nodded quietly, and that was the beginning of something she could not have foreseen. From that day on, Mr. Cliff made it a habit to keep her back after class. Sometimes he would talk to her about school and her future, telling her she was special, that she had the potential to do great things. Other times, he would bring her small gifts, candy, stationery, or storybooks. "This is just between us," he would say with a wink, as if it were a harmless game. Pamela didn't know what to think. Wasn't it good when a teacher cared about his students? But something deep inside her felt uneasy. She tried to tell herself she was just imagining things. After all, he was a respected teacher. He wouldn't do anything wrong. But little by little, the discomfort grew. And soon, Pamela would realize that Mr. Cliff's attention wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. Pamela began feeling increasingly uncomfortable in Mr. Cliff's presence. His lingering touches, his too friendly smiles, and the way he called her special made her stomach churn. At first, she tried to brush off her feelings, convincing herself she was overreacting. But deep inside, a voice whispered that something wasn't right. Mr. Cliff's behavior started escalating. He would brush his hand against hers when handing over her assignments, stand too close when explaining a problem on the board, and call her to his desk more often than necessary. Each time, Pamela felt a wave of unease. One afternoon, after yet another extra lesson, Mr. Cliff leaned in closer than ever and whispered, "You're my favorite student, Pamela. But you have to keep our little lessons a secret, okay?" Pamela froze. Why did it have to be a secret? Why couldn't anyone know? A chill ran down her spine. She didn't have the words to explain what was happening, but she knew this wasn't normal. She had to tell someone. But would they believe her? Pamela's worst fears became reality when Mr. Cliff crossed the line she never thought he would. It was a quiet afternoon after the school extra class when he kept her back in class under the pretense of reviewing her math test. But this time, there was no test. No corrections. Only the look in his eyes that sent a chill through her body. Before she could react, he locked the classroom door. "Relax, Pamela," he whispered. "I told you you're special. Today, I want to show you how to be a woman." Pamela's hands trembled as he stepped closer. Fear paralyzed her. He reached out and stroked her cheek, his touch making her skin crawl. "Don't be scared," he said. "This is just between us." Pamela tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. His grip tightened on her wrist, and her pulse pounded in her ears. Mr. Cliff pulled Pamela's pant down, forced himself on her. Pamela was crying, and Mr. Cliff used one of his hands to cover her mouth. He violated her, and after that he told Pamela never to mention a word to anyone. Otherwise, he will kill her. Tears streamed down her face as he silenced her cries. And in that moment, Pamela's world shattered. The days that followed blurred into a heavy fog of fear and confusion for Pamela. She came to school every morning with a tight knot in her stomach, dreading math class. The once lively girl who laughed with her friends now walked the hallways in silence, her eyes constantly scanning for Mr. Cliff, hoping she wouldn't have to see him. Any time they have maths extra class in the afternoon, Mr. Cliff would call her alone, close the class door and force himself on Pamela. "Oh, sir, stop. It's paining me." "It's so painful, sir," cried Pamela. But Mr. Cliff continued abusing her sexually every week and would always threaten to kill her if she tell anybody. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, but the words refused to leave her lips. His threats echoed in her mind. "No one will believe you. I can make your life miserable." Every time she thought of speaking up, fear gripped her tighter. Pamela withdrew from everything she once loved. Her grades slipped, she stopped talking to her friends, and her once bright smile disappeared. She was trapped in silence, and no one could hear her cries. Pamela carried her fear like an invisible chain, each link forged by silence and the burden of secrets. At school, she moved like a ghost, slipping through the corridors with her head down, avoiding eye contact. The once vibrant girl who laughed with her friends had been replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone trapped in an endless nightmare. She flinched at sudden movements, grew tense whenever Mr. Cliff entered the classroom, and felt her heart race whenever he spoke to her. His eyes followed her constantly, a silent reminder that she was never truly free. At home, the weight of her suffering pressed her deeper into isolation. She longed to tell her parents, to break free from the suffocating grip of fear, but every time she opened her mouth, the words refused to come. They were always too busy, too preoccupied to notice the pain shadowing her face. And even if they did, would they believe her? Would they care enough to listen? One evening, she sat at the dinner table, staring at the untouched plate of food before her. Her mother, scrolling through her phone, barely looked up. Her father was buried in medical reports. The silence stretched between them like an unspoken truth, one she was too terrified to share. "Pamela, why aren't you eating?" her mother finally asked, her tone impatient. "I'm not hungry," she murmured. Her mother sighed. "You've been acting strange lately. If something is wrong, just say it." For a moment, Pamela considered it. She considered throwing caution to the wind and telling them everything. But then she remembered Mr. Cliff's words, his threats, his warnings, the power he held over her. "No," she whispered. "I'm fine." Her father barely acknowledged her response, already lost in his work again. And with that, the moment was gone. The opportunity to speak, to seek help, vanished into the same abyss of neglect where her cries had always drowned. The weight of fear grew heavier, suffocating her as she realized she was truly alone. One Sunday, she was sitting in the car with her mother. She mustered the courage to speak, her voice trembling as she confessed what Mr. Cliff had done. Instead of comfort, her mother dismissed her words. "You're just imagining things," she said coldly. "Mr. Cliff is a respected teacher." Pamela's heart shattered. The one person she thought would protect her had turned away, and she had never felt more alone. Pamela drifted through the days in a daze, her world growing smaller with each passing moment. The walls of her life, home, school, silence, felt like they were caving in on her, trapping her in a prison of fear and loneliness. Her mother's dismissal had shattered the last fragile hope she had been clinging to. If her own mother wouldn't believe her, who would? The thought gnawed at her, deepening the pit in her stomach. Every time she thought of speaking up again, her mother's cold voice echoed in her mind. You're just imagining things. At school, Mr. Cliff carried on as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stolen her sense of safety. He still called on her in class, his voice laced with false kindness, his eyes taunting her. He still smiled when no one was looking, a silent warning that made her skin crawl. But something was different now. He knew. He knew she had tried to tell, and that made him more dangerous. Pamela tried to stay invisible. She kept her head down, rushed through the hallways, and avoided everyone, including her friend Mercy. She couldn't face her. What was the point of telling the truth if it only led to more pain? Pamela, Mercy called one afternoon as they left school. Pamela ignored her and quickened her steps. Pamela, wait. Mercy grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. Why won't you talk to me? Pamela stared at the ground. Just leave me alone, Mercy. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just afraid of Mr. Cliff anymore. She was afraid of what she was becoming. She was disappearing, and no one was coming to save her. Pamela had grown accustomed to the pain, both the emotional wounds that refused to heal and the physical agony that now plagued her body. But that morning, the pain was unbearable. A sharp cramp twisted in her lower abdomen, making her double over in bed. She clenched her sheets, biting back a cry. For weeks, she had ignored the discomfort, dismissing it as exhaustion or stress, but now it had become something more. Her stomach churned, and when she shifted, a searing sting shot through her lower region, making her wince. Something was wrong. Slowly, she forced herself out of bed and into the bathroom. As she pulled down her underwear, her heart dropped. Angry red boils covered her most private area, and a foul-smelling discharge stained her undergarments. Tears blurred her vision as fear gripped her. She knew something terrible had happened to her body, something she had tried to suppress, to forget. Panic swelled in her chest. She wanted to scream, but instead, she pressed her trembling hands to her mouth, stifling the sobs threatening to escape. She felt dirty, broken, used. The pain in her stomach worsened, sharp and unrelenting. A wave of nausea hit her, and she collapsed onto the cold tiles. The room spun, and she gasped for air. She could barely think past the agony consuming her. A sudden knock on the bathroom door startled her. "Pamela, you've been in there for too long," her mother's irritated voice called. "Get ready for school." Pamela tried to respond, but no words came. Instead, a strangled whimper slipped past her lips. The sound must have been enough to alarm her mother because, seconds later, the door swung open. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she took in the sight before her. Pamela curled up on the floor, drenched in sweat, her body trembling with pain. "Pamela!" Her mother rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong?" Pamela tried to speak, but only managed a weak, pained moan. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her stomach, her body convulsing slightly. Panic flashed across her mother's face. "We're going to the hospital. Now." The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear. Pamela could barely keep her eyes open. Her mother kept glancing at her, her own fear evident in the way she gripped the steering wheel tightly. At the hospital, nurses rushed to her aid, lifting her onto a stretcher. Her mother frantically explained Pamela's symptoms as doctors examined her. When the doctor returned with the results, his expression was grim. "Mrs. Cussy, we found signs of severe infection. Your daughter has bruising and internal injuries consistent with sexual assault." Pamela's mother gasped, taking a step back as if the words had physically struck her. What? The doctor's expression softened as he turned to Pamela, who lay weakly on the hospital bed, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "Pamela, can you tell us who did this to you?" Her lips quivered. Her mother's wide, horrified eyes burned into her, waiting for an answer she already knew deep down but had refused to believe. Pamela took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Cliff." The room fell into stunned silence. Her mother's knees buckled, and she clutched onto the side of the hospital bed for support. No, this can't be." Pamela turned her tear-streaked face toward her mother. "I tried to tell you, Mama." Her mother's face crumpled in anguish as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Guilt consumed her, drowning her in the realization that she had failed her daughter when she needed her the most. The doctor's voice was firm. "This needs to be reported immediately. Pamela needs justice." As he spoke, another nurse entered the room, her expression solemn. "Doctor, the infection has spread significantly. We need to prepare her for surgery." Pamela's mother's breath hitched. "Surgery?" The doctor nodded gravely. "Yes. The infection has severely damaged her reproductive organs. We need to remove her womb to save her life." A sharp, stunned silence filled the room. Pamela's mother stared at the doctor, her lips trembling. No, there has to be another way." The doctor's face was solemn. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cussy, but if we don't act now, the infection will spread further. We must perform an emergency hysterectomy." Pamela, too weak to react, let her tears flow silently. Even in her hazy state, she understood the words. The future she had never even thought about, children, motherhood, was being stolen from her, just like everything else. Her mother collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The reality of what had been done to her daughter was finally sinking in. She had ignored the signs, dismissed her cries for help, and now Pamela's body was paying the ultimate price. As the medical team prepared to take her into surgery, Pamela closed her eyes. The last thing she heard before darkness consumed her was her mother's broken whisper. "I'm so sorry, my baby. I'm so sorry." But apologies wouldn't undo what had been done. They wouldn't erase the trauma Pamela had endured. Only one thing mattered now: justice. Pamela awoke to the rhythmic beeping of machines, the soft murmur of voices, and the cold sterility of the hospital room. Her body felt lighter, but at the same time, a deep emptiness gnawed at her soul. She turned her head slowly, her vision adjusting to the dim lighting. Her mother sat beside her, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she noticed Pamela stirring, she reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "My baby," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt and sorrow. "You're awake." On the other side of the bed, her father sat silently, his head buried in his hands. His usually strong, composed demeanor was gone, replaced by the broken shell of a man who had just realized how deeply he had failed his daughter. When he lifted his gaze, his eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with regret. "Pamela," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry." Pamela swallowed, her throat dry. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, a crushing realization settled upon her. The surgery, the damage, the womb that was no longer hers. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned her head away, unable to meet their gazes. She felt hollow, like a part of her had been carved out, stolen from her by the monster who had destroyed her innocence. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The doctor entered, followed by Officer Gladys, the policewoman assigned to Pamela's case. Her uniform was crisp, her expression firm yet kind. "Pamela," the doctor began gently, "the surgery was successful. We were able to stop the infection from spreading. You're going to heal, but," he hesitated, glancing at her parents before continuing, "as we discussed before the operation, we had no choice but to remove your womb." Pamela clenched her jaw, blinking back tears. She had known it was coming, yet hearing it again felt like another wound, another piece of herself taken away. Her father let out a strangled sob, gripping the side of her bed as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. "My baby girl," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "How did I not see this? How did I not protect you?" Officer Gladys stepped forward. "Pamela, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. We have already started investigating Mr. Cliff, and your statement is crucial in ensuring he faces justice." Pamela's breathing hitched. Justice! That word felt heavy on her tongue. Would justice make her whole again? Would it erase the pain? Would it give back what had been stolen from her? Her mother squeezed her hand. "I'm with you," she whispered. "This time, I'm listening." Her father reached for her other hand, his grip firm but trembling. "And so am I," he added. "I swear it." Pamela inhaled shakily and nodded. "I'll talk." Officer Gladys pulled out a notepad. "Start from the beginning, Pamela. Tell me everything." And so she did. She recounted the moment she had tried to forget, the lingering touches, the whispered threats, the fear that had gripped her for so long. She spoke of the first time he had hurt her, of the silence she had been forced to carry, of the helplessness that had nearly swallowed her whole. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. This time, she wouldn't be silenced. By the time she finished, her mother was openly sobbing, and her father sat frozen, his fists clenched, his face twisted in rage and agony. Officer Gladys closed her notepad, her expression dark with determination. "Thank you for your bravery, Pamela. You've done the hardest part, speaking out." Pamela wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Will he be arrested?" Officer Gladys's lips pressed into a thin line. "We already have enough evidence to detain him. With your statement and the medical reports, we will ensure he never does this to anyone else again." A heavy weight lifted from Pamela's chest. It didn't erase the pain, but knowing he wouldn't be able to hurt another girl gave her a small sense of relief. As Officer Gladys left the room, her mother kissed Pamela's forehead. "I failed you," she whispered. "But I swear to you, I will never fail you again." Her father, his voice hoarse with emotion, added, "Neither will I. I will spend the rest of my life making this right." Pamela looked into their eyes, seeing the sincerity behind their words. For the first time, she believed them. Justice was coming, and Pamela would no longer suffer in silence. The days that followed were filled with restless anticipation. Pamela remained in the hospital, her body healing but her heart still fragile. The news of Mr. Cliff's arrest had spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the school and community. Parents were outraged, teachers were shaken, and students whispered in hushed voices, struggling to believe that the man they once respected had been a predator hiding in plain sight. Pamela's father had taken a leave from work to stay by her side, determined to support her in any way he could. Her mother, riddled with guilt, became fiercely protective, ensuring that no detail of the case was overlooked. They had both hired a lawyer, a firm and relentless woman named Mrs. Atiko, who had vowed to make sure Mr. Cliff faced the full force of the law. One afternoon, Officer Gladys returned to the hospital, a folder in her hands and a reassuring smile on her face. "Pamela, we've gathered enough evidence to take this to court," she announced. "Your medical reports, your testimony, and even statements from other students who noticed his unusual behavior will help build a strong case against him." Pamela nodded, gripping the sheets tightly. The idea of seeing him again in court terrified her, but she knew this fight wasn't just for her. It was for every girl who had been silenced, for every victim who never got the chance to speak up. A few days later, the family was called in to meet with the prosecution team. "The case is strong," Mrs. Atiko explained, flipping through the case file. "But we need Pamela to testify. It will be difficult, but her words are the most powerful weapon we have." Pamela felt her father's hand on hers, steadying her. "We'll be right there with you," he assured her. "You don't have to do this alone." Pamela swallowed hard, fear creeping in, but she straightened her shoulders. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "I won't let him get away with this." The trial date arrived sooner than expected. Pamela walked into the courtroom with her parents flanking her, their presence giving her strength. As she took the witness stand, her heart pounded, but when she saw Mr. Cliff sitting across the room, his once confident expression now replaced with fear, she knew she had the power now. With a deep breath, she told her story. Every painful detail, every moment of terror, every plea for help that had gone unheard. The courtroom was silent, every word she spoke weighing heavy in the air. When she finished, the judge looked at her with something close to admiration. "Thank you for your courage, Pamela." The defense tried to twist her words, but Pamela stood firm, her resolve unshakable. Witness after witness came forward, students who had seen his behavior, a fellow teacher who had felt uneasy about his interactions with young girls, and finally, the medical experts who confirmed the horrifying extent of what Pamela had suffered. Days later, the verdict was read, guilty. The room erupted into murmurs, but Pamela barely heard them. A sob of relief escaped her mother, and her father squeezed her hand as tears filled his own eyes. Mr. Cliff was sentenced to life in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, Pamela finally felt the weight lift off her shoulders. Justice had been served. It wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a step toward healing. Walking out of the courtroom, she felt the sun on her skin, warmer than it had ever been. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. In the weeks following the trial, Pamela's home felt different. The air was no longer thick with distance and silence. Her parents, once consumed by their work, had become her unwavering pillars of support. Her father, who had always been buried in medical reports, now made time to sit with her, to listen, to be present. He took her on walks, shared stories from his own childhood, and reminded her that she was more than what had been done to her. Her mother, once distracted and emotionally distant, transformed into the protector Pamela had always needed. She took time off work, cooked Pamela's favorite meals, and held her close during the nights when nightmares threatened to pull her back into the darkness. Therapy became a part of their routine. Pamela attended sessions with a kind psychologist who helped her untangle the pain and fear she had carried for so long. Her parents joined some of the sessions, learning how to better support her, how to truly listen. It was uncomfortable at times, painful even, but it was healing. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, her father cleared his throat. "Pamela, your mother and I have been thinking. We don't want to just move on from this. We want to do something meaningful. Her mother nodded. We want to help other girls who have been through what you have. We're starting a foundation in your name to provide counseling, legal help, and awareness for girls who need a voice. Pamela's eyes widened. Really? Her father reached for her hand. You are strong, Pamela, and your story will help others find their strength too. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain this time, but from hope. She looked around at the family she had almost lost, the love she had once feared would never come. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. They were healing together. And for the first time in a long while, Pamela allowed herself to believe in something again, the future. This is a lesson to all parents to always listen and be there for their kids. If not, predators will attack and destroy them. If this story was interesting to you, like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Turn on your notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.